Ben Shapiro recently transformed Representative Ilhan Omar into the most deeply embarrassed political figure in modern American history, systematically dismantling her entire ideological framework on a public stage in a debate that will be studied for decades. During a highly anticipated live university broadcast flanked by dozens of high-definition cameras, hundreds of reporters, and a deeply polarized, vibrating audience of thousands, Representative Ilhan Omar looked directly at the conservative commentator and uttered the precise phrase that would orchestrate her own rhetorical downfall. She was entirely oblivious to the fact that this specific statement would irrevocably break her argument. Rather, she was absolutely convinced it was her ultimate masterstroke. This massive blind spot had perpetually been the greatest, most fatal flaw of modern populist politicians. Their absolute, unwavering inability to discern the boundary between a triumphant, applause-worthy victory and the exact moment they actively handed their adversary the very weapon that would inevitably defeat them. Originally, the campus gathering was scheduled as a routine, heavily moderated discussion regarding modern economic policy and systemic reform. It was meant to be a standard academic appearance, complete with university banners, student press pools, and predictably safe talking points, the sort of mundane, highly controlled political theater that grabs a short 11-second clip on social media before being instantly dismissed from public memory. The university had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars securing the venue, deploying heavy security details, and ensuring that the lighting perfectly framed the participants. However, the representative possessed vastly different, exponentially larger ambitions for this evening. Her political strategists had devoted weeks to meticulously preparing for this exact clash. They had scripted every potential response, rehearsed every emotional appeal, and choreographed every conversational pivot. They had run mock debates and closed-door sessions in Washington, anticipating every possible conservative talking point. For Omar, this was never merely a discussion on economics. It was prime promotional material, a carefully calculated theatrical performance meant to solidify her status as the uncompromising, unquestioned champion of the American working class and the ultimate vanquisher of conservative capitalist ideology. She intended to use this high-profile platform as a definitive launchpad for broader national influence, aiming to prove that progressive socialism could triumph over free market conservatism on a live, unedited stage. To comprehend how a prominent politician who had flawlessly commanded congressional hearing rooms and dominated cable news segments managed to completely unravel in under an hour beneath the academic lights, one must meticulously analyze her expansive opening remarks, the psychological warfare at play, as well as the immediate, devastating inquiry that her opponent countered with. Omar confidently approached the microphones first, carrying a massive, thick binder of heavily researched notes, color-coded tabs, and printed statistics, as was her customary practice when facing hostile or complex environments. A subordinate quietly adjusted her microphone, ensuring the audio levels would capture the emotional resonance of her voice. She briefly inspected her meticulously highlighted documents, took a deep, centering breath, and looked up with a practiced, empathetic smile that had been focus grouped to project both warmth and unyielding strength. Shapiro emerged onto the stage moments later entirely unaccompanied, lacking any staff members, briefing binders, teleprompters, or even a single sheet of paper. He moved with a brisk, calculated energy. He casually adjusted his chair, checked the microphone level with a quick rhythmic tap of his index finger, and offered a vague, unbothered smirk to the tense, overcrowded room. The contrast was immediately striking and intentionally stark. The institutional politician fortified by a fortress of paperwork versus the independent debater armed with nothing but raw, unfiltered cognitive speed. Bypassing the moderator's gentle, long-winded introductions, Omar launched directly into her prepared monologue, her voice ringing out with crystalline clarity. "Allow me to clarify a few absolute realities before we begin this charade," she declared, her voice echoing with practiced, righteous indignation. She boasted about her relentless, uncompromising fight against systemic inequality, proclaiming that the current economic structure actively and intentionally oppresses the working class to enrich a handful of multinational corporations. She asserted that the only moral, ethical path forward was the immediate, unconditional cancellation of all student loan debt, the implementation of massive federally funded social safety nets, universal basic income, and the aggressive nationalization of the healthcare industry. Crucially, she emphasized that true justice required completely dismantling the greed of the billionaire elite, speaking with the fiery, rhythmic cadence of a revolutionary leading a historic charge. She painted a vivid, harrowing picture of a nation fundamentally broken by late-stage capitalism, insisting that her radical legislative proposals were the sole desperate remedy for decades of systemic neglect, racial disparities, and corporate exploitation. Leaving a perfectly calculated, dramatic pause that allowed the acoustics of the hall to carry her final syllable into the rafters, she turned her body entirely towards Shapiro, sitting just a few feet away, and delivered the exact razor-sharp blow her team had aggressively workshopped in their private practice sessions. With all due respect to the format of this academic debate, we do not need lectures on fiscal responsibility from conservative individuals who prioritize corporate profit margins and Wall Street dividends over the literal survival of human beings, she stated sharply, her eyes locked onto him. The jab hit its mark with devastating precision. Several hundred students in the front rows instinctively snapped their fingers in approval. A wave of enthusiastic murmurs rolled through the progressive wing of the audience, while a senior political aide standing in the background, shadows offered rapid, enthusiastic nods of encouragement. The remark was sharp, ideologically loaded, perfectly delivered, and explicitly designed to draw first blood, a fact Omar clearly relished. As was her trademark after landing a solid rhetorical punch on television, she leaned back in her chair, lifting her chin slightly, allowing the heavy, politically charged silence to amplify her moral critique. If you are exhausted by witnessing out-of-touch officials preach to the public about empathy and morality while their own policies create absolute economic chaos, hit that like button immediately, because Ben Shapiro's reaction and his ensuing methodical psychological deconstruction are about to utterly derail the representative's grand, meticulously planned ambitions. Shapiro did not react to the provocation in the way her strategists had anticipated. He displayed absolutely no visible irritation, no defensive posturing, no raised voice, and no desire to interrupt her moment of glory. Instead, he simply observed her with the exhausted clinical patience of a forensic auditor evaluating a mathematically impossible ledger that had been submitted by a fraudulent accountant. He nodded at a deliberate, measured, almost agonizingly slow pace. That was a highly emotional, incredibly theatrical, and beautifully delivered campaign speech, Representative Shapiro finally remarked. His voice was entirely devoid of sarcasm, keeping a flat, analytical tone which somehow made the statement exponentially more piercing than if he had yelled. Truly impressive rhetoric. It sounded fantastic. Did you rehearse that moral condemnation in front of a mirror, or was that purely organically spontaneous? Still coasting on the adrenaline of her opening insult and the validation of the snapping crowd, Omar quickly retorted, leaning into the microphone, "I speak from a place of deep, unwavering conviction and lived reality. I do not need a rehearsed script to defend the vulnerable people of this country. I speak for them." Shapiro echoed the word conviction, dissecting it slowly, rolling the syllables around as if weighing a physical, heavy object in the palm of his hand. "I deeply appreciate that phrasing," Shapiro noted, adjusting his posture to lean slightly forward, resting his elbows on the desk. All right, if we are communicating genuinely without scripts about conviction and defending the vulnerable today, that is excellent, because I have a couple of exceptionally straightforward inquiries for you. Very basic economic concepts. The exact type of elementary concepts that anyone claiming to champion the American working class should be able to grasp without consulting a briefing binder. A ripple of highly nervous energy moved through the press corps situated at the back of the room. Beneath his relaxed posture and rapid-fire, staccato delivery, a subtle, inescapable, and lethal philosophical trap had been meticulously set. Omar had just publicly, aggressively affirmed to the national audience that she valued deep personal conviction, that she spoke authentically for the working class, and that she operated without the need for political scripting. Consequently, she was now solely, entirely accountable for reconciling those noble, high-minded values with the actual brutal mathematical realities of her legislative policies. Representative, I heard you loud and clear when you stated with absolute certainty that the working class is being actively exploited by the system, Shapiro continued, his gaze locking onto hers. So humor me for a moment. Let us test that conviction. You are currently advocating for the total unconditional forgiveness of all student loan debt to the tune of nearly $2 trillion funded entirely by the federal government. Yes or no? Omar answered cleanly, sensing an easy philosophical win and a chance to reiterate her platform. It is a moral imperative to free our youth from predatory lending practices that keep them chained to generational poverty. Yes, we must cancel the debt. A moral imperative, Shapiro affirmed, nodding as if making a mental note. Excellent. So my question to you is incredibly straightforward. Explain to me why it is morally justifiable to take the federal tax dollars of a 25-year-old plumber who chose to go to a local trade school, who works 50 grueling hours a week in the physical labor force, and who deliberately avoided taking on debt and used his hard-earned money to pay off the $100,000 graduate loan of an upper-middle-class university student who voluntarily chose to study a niche academic field with absolutely zero market value? How exactly is transferring wealth from the blue-collar, sweating working class to the privileged, college-educated elite a victory for the oppressed? Omar's jaw clenched fractionally. She was intimately familiar with this specific line of questioning, having navigated milder versions of it in friendly, heavily edited media interviews, and she immediately sought safer rhetorical ground, utilizing the exact pivots her communications director had drilled into her. You are intentionally using divisive, cherry-picked, bad faith examples to mask a much broader systemic failure of the capitalist system, she deflected, her voice rising in pitch and volume to project authority over the crowd. Education is a fundamental human right, not a luxury commodity reserved for the wealthy. Framing this vital issue as a petty battle between tradesmen and university students is a classic, tired, right-wing tactic designed to divide the working class against itself so that the billionaires can continue to rob them blind. Shapiro interjected smoothly, his speed increasing to cut effortlessly through the thick layer of political rhetoric. I did not ask for a sociological theory on class warfare, Representative. I asked specifically about the plumber and the graduate student. Who actually pays the bill? The federal government has absolutely no money of its own. It only possesses the money it extracts through the threat of force from American taxpayers. So when you stand at a podium and say forgive the debt, you actually mean transfer the debt. It doesn't magically vanish. Why should the man who made responsible, difficult financial choices be forced to subsidize the person who did not? It is a direct binary question of morality, Shapiro pressed, his hands gesturing sharply to punctuate his logic. At this exact juncture, an incredibly subtle physical reaction occurred, one captured perfectly by the high-definition broadcast lenses, but largely overlooked by the live viewers in the hall, until the footage was later painstakingly decelerated and scrutinized frame by frame on the internet. For a mere fraction of a second, Omar's gaze darted rapidly downward toward the thick binder resting open on her desk. Her eyes frantically scanned the highlighted text, desperately seeking the pre-written counter-argument, processed the terrifying lack of a direct answer to this specific framing, and darted back up to the audience. Instantly, her polished demeanor and righteous indignation were fully, artificially restored. We must look at the macroeconomic benefits of freeing up that capital into the broader consumer economy, she announced confidently. attempting to steer the dangerous conversation into the safer waters of abstract economic theory. When millions of young people are no longer burdened by crushing monthly debt payments, they buy homes, they start small businesses, they participate in the market, and they stimulate massive, unprecedented economic growth that benefits everyone, including your hypothetical plumber. Shapiro slowly shook his head, a gesture of profound disappointment, refusing to let the blatant evasion stand unchallenged. You are completely, willfully evading the underlying morality of the transaction, he mused, leaning back slightly. But fine. Let us follow your economic thread to its logical, disastrous conclusion. You want to inject trillions of dollars of newly printed money into the economy through debt cancellation, massive federal housing subsidies, and universal health care. Do you have any idea what actually happens to the working class when you flood the consumer market with fiat currency? Listen, we all understand you want to appear infinitely compassionate. Everyone loves giving away free things. The media adores politicians who stand at podiums and promise free things. He dismissed the thought with a wave of his hand. But Representative, here is the problem I need you to clarify for the millions watching. You just broadcasted to this room that you want to protect the poor. So what is the exact mathematical mechanism that happens to the price of basic groceries, gasoline, electricity, and housing when the government prints trillions of dollars out of thin air to fund your utopian programs? Omar attempted to pivot again, leaning aggressively into the microphone, her tone dripping with disdain for his premise. The inflation we are currently seeing in the market is not caused by government spending. It is driven entirely by unmitigated corporate greed, monopolistic behavior, and supply chain price gouging. Corporations are exploiting a crisis to pad their bottom lines, not because we are making investments in the American people. Shapiro cut her off effortlessly, his voice slicing through the applause of her supporters. I am asking for the basic economic reality of monetary supply, Representative, not a focus group campaign slogan about greedy CEOs. When you drastically increase the money supply, chasing the exact same amount of goods without simultaneously increasing the production of those goods, what happens to prices? Give me the economic reality. Don't give me a speech, give me the math. Reluctantly, trapped by the inescapable laws of basic mathematics that even her most ardent supporters could not deny, Omar stated defensively, obviously, there are some minor inflationary pressures in any growing, stimulated economy, but they are entirely manageable compared to the devastating generational human cost of doing absolutely nothing and letting people starve. Shapiro allowed that stunning, monumental admission to hang heavily in the air. He didn't rush to the next point. He let the uncomfortable reality fester and sink into the minds of the audience, much like a physician allowing a grim diagnosis to fully resonate before discussing the painful treatment. Representative, I confess I am entirely stunned by that incredibly casual dismissal of economic suffering, Shapiro concluded, his tone hardening into something resembling genuine anger. You are explicitly admitting that your policies create inflationary pressures. Inflation is a highly regressive tax. It destroys the purchasing power of the exact low-income, marginalized individuals you claim to fiercely protect. The billionaire CEO you constantly vilify does not care if a gallon of milk suddenly costs an extra $3 or if a tank of gas costs an extra $40. It doesn't affect his lifestyle. But the single mother working 2 minimum wage jobs, whom you constantly use as a prop in your campaign speeches, certainly does care. You are literally mathematically bankrupting the poor at the grocery store checkout line to pay for the ideological academic experiments of the wealthy progressive elite. Even if I were an evil supervillain actively attempting to destroy the American working class, I could not design a more brutally efficient system than your platform. Omar fired back, her composure beginning to fracture visibly. That is a vast, simplistic, and entirely dishonest distortion of an economic emergency that has evolved over several decades of unregulated, predatory, disastrous capitalism. It is the fundamental economic law of supply and demand. Representative, not my personal opinion, Shapiro countered, his voice steady as a metronome. and you are ignoring it with absolute terrifying conviction. The atmosphere in the massive university hall fundamentally shifted. The supportive, rowdy murmurs from her side of the aisle completely died down. A distinct, suffocating, heavy tension emerged in the space. The abstract, high-minded concept of progressive policy suddenly felt incredibly heavy and real, much like an invisible, inescapable tax becoming painfully concrete the very moment you check a dwindling bank balance. Sensing the extreme danger to her narrative, Omar executed what she did best, the only tactic she had left. She pivoted aggressively, violently toward emotional outrage. If we are obligated to sit here and debate cold economics, we must equally acknowledge the profound, bleeding human suffering that your conservative ideology completely ignores. Omar asserted, her voice echoing loudly and passionately through the microphone, her eyes wide with fury. You sit there, safe in your privilege, and use cold, heartless, calculated numbers to justify leaving desperate families to starve on the concrete streets, while multinational corporations reap record, astronomical profits. You do not care about people, you only care about spreadsheets. Shapiro quickly interrupted, instantly locking onto her tactic like a heat-seeking missile. You are using manufactured theatrical outrage to mask a profound, embarrassing lack of mathematics, Representative. That is the entire crux of the issue with your platform. You promise infinite compassion, but your math delivers guaranteed poverty. You claim to fight for the marginalized, but when a visionary business wants to build a factory in your district and provide thousands of secure, high-paying jobs with excellent benefits, your suffocating regulatory policies and massive tax proposals drive them out of existence. They sprint away from your jurisdiction. Corporations move their headquarters to survive, certainly. But tell me this, why are regular middle-class citizens suffering under your leadership? Why is the cost of living, the crime rate, and the homelessness crisis in the major cities managed exclusively by your political allies the absolute highest in the entire nation? Do you comprehend the scale of the financial destruction your specific policies have caused? Hundreds of thousands of desperate residents are packing U-Hauls and fleeing blue states, and they did not migrate to European socialist utopias, Representative. They fled to conservative American states that actually function, that respect their tax dollars, and that allow them to build a life. And in that moment, it happened a second time, proving that the first instance was not a fluke. Omar's eyes darted rapidly downward for half a second to the concealed, heavily tabbed notes beneath her hands, desperately seeking a lifeline, before snapping back to the audience. Viewers watching the live broadcast instantly recognized that specific downward glance. It was the universal, panicked tell of every unprepared student desperately checking a textbook under the desk during a final exam, when the strict professor demands an answer they simply do not possess. In that instant, the American public began to grasp a fundamental, undeniable truth about the representative that glossy magazine profiles, friendly late-night television interviews, and carefully curated social media feeds had constantly obscured. She did not actually understand the mechanisms of her own policies. She only understood the marketing of them. Omar, however, swiftly regained her balance, flashing a fiercely defiant look. We are building a historic grassroots movement that cares about equity, fairness, and human dignity, not just gross domestic product and corporate profit margins. We are fighting for people who have been historically, systematically marginalized by a racist system. Citizens are joining our movement in droves every single day because they are waking up to the truth. They are joining due strictly to your relentless narrative of victimhood. Representative Shapiro corrected swiftly, refusing to yield an inch of rhetorical ground. You are deliberately bleeding them of their personal independence and heavily advertising a false toxic dependency on the state in order to permanently acquire new voters. Omar bristled, her posture going completely rigid. That is an intensely deceptive, profoundly offensive, and frankly bigoted framing of our movement. But is it factually incorrect? Shapiro challenged, his eyebrows raised. Omar offered absolutely no rebuttal. She stared at him, her mouth slightly open, the silence deafening. She had just admitted on live television to supporting policies that drive devastating inflation while simultaneously claiming to help the poor. The most prominent businesses were evacuating her allied cities, accompanied by massive waves of frustrated, exhausted residents, and with every probing, logical inquiry the conservative commentator launched, she instinctively sought answers from a hidden binder compiled by uncredited staffers. Drop a single word in the comment section below to show you're still watching this breakdown, because the representative is preparing to launch the most ferocious, desperate counterattack of her entire career, and her upcoming statement is absolutely crucial to understanding her ultimate downfall. Omar had finally reached her absolute boiling point. A visceral, undeniable shift occurred within her, permanently shattering her traditionally flawless, media-trained delivery. What erupted from her in the next moment was unfiltered, intensely aggressive, and considerably more volatile than any rehearsed talking point her highly paid communication team had ever drafted. This was an unscripted, genuinely furious Ilhan Omar, stripping away the polish. You dare to sit on this stage in this university and lecture me regarding what the working class needs. You? Omar challenged, fully pivoting her body toward Shapiro, knocking her microphone slightly askew, and completely disregarding the moderator, the rules of the debate, and the cameras for the first time all evening. You spend your days hiding behind a podcast microphone, protecting billionaires who wouldn't cross the street to help a starving child. You aggressively oppose health care for all. You oppose a living wage. You actively defend a broken, inherently racist, colonial system that literally profits off the sickness, the incarceration, and the poverty of minorities. How dare you pretend to hold the moral high ground over me? She leaned aggressively over the wooden table, her volume dropping into a menacing, highly theatrical register that vibrated through the speakers. What she delivered next was not a political counter-argument. It was a direct, ideological ultimatum meant to rally her base. We will not stop. I will litigate against your worldview every single instance I get. I will actively obstruct your conservative agenda whenever you attempt to protect the wealthy elite. We will completely dismantle the systems of oppression you defend. We will tax the elite until extreme inequality is permanently eradicated, and we will absolutely never ever apologize for fighting for the survival of the vulnerable. That is not merely a political promise. It is an absolute guarantee. We will liberate the working class no matter what it takes. The attack landed with a deafening, thunderous roar of approval from her side of the auditorium. Students jumped to their feet, cheering wildly. The energy of the room violently shifted. For approximately half a minute of sustained applause, total control of the narrative belonged entirely to Ilhan Omar. In that brief shining window, she embodied the absolute most formidable iteration of her political self. Had the broadcast completely terminated precisely then, due to a power outage or a scheduled cut, that specific fiery soundbite would have dominated global headlines by morning, complete with the caption, "Omar decimates Shapiro," and speculation regarding her absolute dominance over conservative media would have ignited immediately across all progressive networks. However, the debate did not conclude there. The cameras continued to roll, and Shapiro did not display even a microscopic shred of intimidation. He patiently allowed Omar to complete her tirade. He allowed the crowd to scream themselves hoarse, to expend all their emotional energy, letting the heavy, exhausted silence following her final syllable stretch uncomfortably, agonizingly long. When Shapiro finally responded, his tone had plummeted to a slower, incredibly precise, almost chillingly calm register. The subtle shift in his vocal gravity caused the entire room, even her most ardent, screaming supporters, to physically lean closer to the stage, compelled by the sheer weight of his composure. Representative, I will be remarkably transparent with you. You possess an incredible, undeniable talent for theatrical outrage. You are a gifted performer, Shapiro began, his voice cutting through the remaining whispers in the room. But here is the pattern I just observed over the last 45 minutes, Representative, and I guarantee the millions of audience members watching from their living rooms observed exactly the same thing. Shapiro continued, raising his right hand to tally the specific points on his fingers. I questioned you regarding the basic morality of transferring student debt to hardworking plumbers. You deflected by bringing up systemic failure. I questioned you about the mathematical reality of inflation, crushing the poor at the grocery store. You deflected by bringing up corporate greed. I questioned you about your heavy-handed policies destroying jobs and forcing residents to flee. And you delivered a theatrical, shouting monologue exclusively attacking my personal character and my podcast. He lowered his hand, resting it flat on the table. Representative, if your ideology is truly mathematically superior, why are you fundamentally incapable of discussing its actual tangible outcomes for a mere 2 minutes without desperately changing the subject to morality, racism, or my personal flaws? 3 inquiries regarding substantive policy had been met with 3 emotional deflections attacking her opponent's motives. If you have ever posed a direct factual question to a public official and received a labyrinth of emotional manipulation instead of a concrete, honest answer, make sure to subscribe to this channel right now. Because the representative's upcoming retort was completely unscripted, fueled by pure adrenaline, and it proved to be the specific, fatal phrase that irrevocably ruined her argument and exposed her core philosophy. Do not look away. The room hung in massive suspense. Omar desperately needed to halt his intellectual momentum. Aides stationed behind the camera bays were sweating, internally screaming for their boss to return to the safety of the scripted talking points regarding infrastructure or green energy. But she lacked the capacity to retreat into logic. Relentless, uncompromising emotional aggression had forged her political celebrity, and it was exactly what would seal her ideological destruction in a logical arena. The boundary separating her meteoric rise from her absolute crushing ruin amounted to a single fatal, overconfident sentence. You wish to debate outcomes and trustworthiness? Omar scoffed, a bitter, dismissive laugh escaping her lips. I have never once stopped fighting to liberate people from a capitalist system that keeps them chained to poverty. We fight to make them free. I absolutely never betray the working class. I am fighting for their absolute freedom. The final word escaped her lips, echoing across the massive venue. Roughly 50% of the attendees instantly realized the catastrophic, inescapable philosophical trap she had just willingly walked into, while the other 50% remained blissfully oblivious, ready to cheer again. The immense gap between those two factions manifested as a suffocating, breathless, terrifying silence that blanketed the auditorium. Shapiro immediately ceased all movement. The rapid-fire debater, the quick-witted commentator, evaporated in a heartbeat. The persona that replaced it was chillingly focused, level, completely devoid of humor, and utterly motionless. Representative Shapiro said, his voice dangerously quiet, forcing everyone to strain to hear him. You just declared that your ultimate goal is to make people free. It wasn't framed as a question, but as a deliberate, heavy repetition, placing the words down carefully upon the table like fragile, explosive glassware. Free is the specific, absolute term you chose to employ. Omar immediately sensed the atmospheric pressure drop in the room, recognizing the danger, but was fundamentally trapped by her own passionate rhetoric. She could not walk it back without appearing weak. I fully, unapologetically, stand behind that assertion, she replied tightly, her eyes narrowing. All right, Shapiro nodded lethargically, accepting the premise. Let us thoroughly examine your specific version of freedom. You want the federal government to provide their housing. You want the government to mandate, control, and provide their health care. You want the government to forgive their education loans, supply their baseline universal income, regulate their food supply, and dictate their employment terms. He paused significantly, letting the list hang in the air. Representative, a creature whose housing, feeding, medical care, and daily survival are entirely dependent on the benevolence of a central commanding authority is not a free human being. That is the exact dictionary definition of a ward of the state. It is the definition of a pet. The ensuing silence was vastly, profoundly different from the pause following a political applause line or a clever joke. It was a suffocating physical silence, the specific type of quiet that presses aggressively against your eardrums, making you hyper-aware of the subtle hum of the building's massive air conditioning unit, because all human noise, all breathing, had been completely extinguished by the sheer weight of the analogy. But here is the critical underlying detail I want the national audience to fully process today, Representative. Given your constant, unending lectures regarding liberation and freedom, Shapiro continued relentlessly, his eyes boring into hers. True freedom is the ability to walk away. True freedom is the ability to own the fruits of your own labor, to build your own wealth, to make your own mistakes, and to survive completely independently of the politicians sitting in marble buildings in Washington, D.C. You do not actually want to liberate the working class, because if they become financially independent, if they build their own wealth, they no longer need you. If they no longer need you, you lose your relevance, your platform, and your immense political power. You do not want to free them. You want to absolutely monopolize their dependency. You expertly feed the audience exactly what they desire to hear, the seductive promise of an easy life without struggle, without risk, and without consequence, so that you can secure their votes in the next election and endlessly expand the exact governmental power that you personally wield over their lives. Shapiro paused before delivering the ultimate concluding thought, a sentence that forced everyone present in the hall to mentally replay the entire hour-long debate through a completely new, terrifying lens. You have been deploying that exact same deceptive, emotional manipulation at this table for the last hour. You are aware of that, correct? That single brilliant observation functioned like a master key unlocking a complicated mechanism. Instantly, the viewers recognized the undeniable glaring pattern. When pressed on the mathematics of inflation, she looked down at her notes and resurfaced with an emotional distraction about corporate greed. When challenged on the morality of debt transfer, she pivoted to systemic racism. It was an identical routine, every single instance, the lightning, fast downward glance, the flawlessly articulated emotional deflection, and the immediate reinstatement of her righteous, fiery indignation, resetting perfectly like a computer monitor springing back to life. The rhythm of the deception was so blatantly obvious in retrospect that it served as concrete, undeniable validation of a fundamental insincerity they had always inherently suspected but previously lacked the visual, undeniable proof to confirm. Shapiro had brutally illuminated the mechanism of progressive populism. If the prospect of that level of profound political manipulation terrifies you, forward this clip to a friend right now. Then continue watching, because the representative still possessed one final desperate defense, and the subsequent rebuttal is something everyone absolutely must witness to understand modern politics. Omar remained completely frozen at the microphone, wrapped in a prolonged, agonizing silence. When she finally broke the quiet, her demeanor had fundamentally altered. The aggressive, revolutionary polish had vanished. The heavily rehearsed cadence was stripped away completely. For a fleeting instant, her response possessed a raw, undeniable, almost tragic desperation. You desperately want to reduce my entire movement, my life's work, to a cynical, calculated power grab? Very well, Omar challenged, her voice hitching authentically on the words, stripping away the armor. She allowed the emotional crack to resonate through the hall. But you do not possess the right to dismiss the lived experiences of millions who suffer under this brutal economy. I have fiercely battled for every single person who feels left behind by American capitalism. My family fled war. We lived in refugee camps. I know what true visceral suffering is. I have been locked in a relentless battle for survival since before I came to this country. Every single day of my life has been a fight against a system designed to crush people like me. The raw emotional output felt shockingly genuine. The atmosphere in the room fully absorbed the immense weight of her confession. For a fleeting moment, she had finally displayed her core humanity, stripping away the politician to reveal the survivor. Yet Shapiro remained utterly stoic. He held his ground, waiting patiently for her to finish. And his subsequent response is the exact reason this particular debate will be studied in communication courses for years. Shapiro allowed the heavy, deeply emotional silence to linger in the auditorium. He deliberately chose not to trample her vulnerability, waiting patiently before shifting his vocal inflection. When he finally spoke, the combative edge was entirely gone. Representative, I genuinely believe your testimony, Shapiro acknowledged, letting the validation sit for a respectful moment. I believe you have fought relentlessly. Not a single soul here denies your severe personal struggles or the unimaginable tragedy of war. However, there is a fundamental mystery your supporters have spent years trying to solve, and I believe they just figured it out. He locked eyes directly with Omar, his voice softening but carrying immense weight. You just delivered a profoundly moving monologue detailing your tragic history and your individual triumph against astronomical odds. It is a testament to the American dream. But, Representative, throughout that entire impassioned defense, which you claimed came straight from your soul, you failed to mention human agency a single time. The silence that followed was absolute and final. You omitted the incredible capacity of individuals to overcome desperate circumstances. You entirely ignored the millions of immigrants and working-class citizens who built magnificent, independent lives in this exact same economic system through sheer grit, massive sacrifice, and profound personal responsibility. You view your constituents solely as perpetual, helpless victims who cannot possibly survive without your benevolent, guiding government intervention. You fiercely defended your existence on this stage, and every sentiment revolved around the absolute necessity of your power to save them. You have been locked in a fierce battle your entire life, Representative, but you simply never fought for their independence. Those final words blanketed the room like an inescapable judicial ruling. It wasn't a crude political jab. It was the crushing weight of an undeniable truth striking without warning. Nobody chuckled. Nobody shifted. Omar remained completely frozen behind the desk. Slowly, her hand drifted downward, closing the thick binder of notes. There was no salvation in the printed text, no calculated talking point to counter that brutal philosophical truth. Defeated, she physically pushed the binder away. The subtle, dry scrape of the cardboard against the wooden table was incredibly faint, yet it echoed massively across the deadened room. Every broadcast camera captured the symbolic, total surrender. The logic had simply run out. A student journalist near the stage nervously cleared his throat. Representative, do you have any response? He prompted timidly. Omar stared vacantly at the void between the cameras and Shapiro. She offered no reply. By the time network directors severed the live feeds, the brutal interaction was already immortalized. Within 60 minutes, a prominent conservative senator published a viral 5-word reaction. He just described their whole ideology. That collective realization propelled the raw footage to viral speeds. Shapiro quickly exited the facility into the cool night air, leaving without impromptu interviews. His black SUV drove away. Omar lingered for nearly 2 minutes, staring at the wood, before a staff member tapped her sleeve. She retrieved her binder and departed without making eye contact, realizing the massive ideological fortress she had constructed contained a glaring vulnerability the whole world now saw. If you found yourself agreeing with the immense power of hard facts over manipulative feelings, smash that like button. If you are entirely exhausted by politicians manipulating the vulnerable to secure power, subscribe immediately. Drop the word responsibility in the comments and forward this video to someone who understands the daily grind of hard work with absolutely no excuses.